The Crystal Award felt heavy in my hands as I stood on the stage of the Wentworth Ballroom that July evening. 200 people had risen to their feet, applauding my acceptance of Boston Marketing Association's Executive of the Year. The spotlight was warm against my skin, and the reflection of chandelier light against the glass trophy sent prisms dancing across my black cocktail dress. In that moment, I had everything: career success, respect from peers, and the admiration of everyone who mattered. Everyone except my husband. James sat at our reserved table, front and center. While others stood, he remained seated, his expression unnervingly calm. He wore the navy suit I'd bought him for our 10th anniversary 3 months earlier, his dark hair neatly combed, his posture perfect. But something was wrong. The slight smile that had been there during dinner had vanished. Now? His eyes tracked my every movement with the cold precision of a predator. "I want to thank my amazing team at Vertex Solutions," I said into the microphone, my voice steady despite the unease building inside me. "This award belongs to all of us, and to my husband James, who has supported me through countless late nights and business trips. I couldn't have done this without you." The crowd turned toward him, expecting the customary appreciative nod or wave. Instead, James reached under the table and pulled out his laptop. The applause faltered as he opened it and pressed a few keys. I noticed our company's IT director, Michael, glance at James with a look of grim complicity. "Melissa," the association president said beside me, "would you like to say a few more words about your journey this year?" I stepped back to the microphone, but the words caught in my throat as the large projection screen behind me, meant for my presentation slides, suddenly illuminated with a map. A map with a timeline, a map with dates, a map showing locations that were definitely not where I had told James I was. "What is this?" I whispered, though the microphone caught my words and broadcast them across the silent ballroom. James stood then, adjusting his tie as he moved toward the stage with deliberate steps. He carried a small remote in his hand. Every eye in the room followed him, including those of my boss, my colleagues, and worst of all, my parents who had come to celebrate with me. "I think," James said, his voice carrying without need of amplification, "that Melissa is being modest. Let me share more details about her remarkable year." He clicked the remote. The map zoomed in on Boston, then shifted to show a route heading west, not to the Albany conference I'd claimed to attend in March, but to a small lakeside resort in the Berkshires. Another click showed a reservation confirmation, not in my name, in the name Melissa Stevens, my maiden name. "James," I said, voice trembling as I moved toward him, "this isn't the time." "Actually, it's exactly the time," he replied, loud enough for the front tables to hear. "I've waited for the perfect moment, just like you waited for the perfect lies." I reached for the remote, but he sidestepped me easily. The room had gone completely silent, the celebration atmosphere evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "I don't know what you think you're doing," I hissed, "but you're embarrassing yourself." James smiled then, a smile I'd never seen before, one devoid of warmth, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Am I? Let's check the data." Another click. The screen showed my car's GPS data, tracking my movements over 6 months, not to Chicago, not to New York, not to the client meetings or industry events I'd meticulously described to him over dinners. Instead, there were hotel names, timestamps, durations of stays. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. The Crystal Award slipped from my fingers, hitting the stage with a heavy thud, but miraculously not shattering, like my life was about to do. "Melissa has always been incredibly detail-oriented," James continued, addressing the room as if giving a business presentation. "She told me about her meeting with Apex Corporation in downtown Chicago on February 12th. She even mentioned the deep dish pizza they ordered for lunch." Click. The screen showed my car parked not in Chicago, but at a boutique hotel in Newport, Rhode Island, for 18 hours. She described the view from her New York conference room on April 5th, how she could see Central Park from the 38th floor. Click. My car, parked at a cabin rental agency in Vermont. The crowd began to murmur. I saw my boss's expression shift from confusion to dawning comprehension. My mother's hand covered her mouth in shock. My father looked away, unable to watch. "James, please," I whispered, no longer caring if others heard my pleading. "Not here, not like this." He turned to me then, and I saw something beyond anger in his eyes. I saw grief. I saw months of suspicion confirmed. I saw the death of trust. "You chose the stage, Melissa," he said quietly. "You chose the audience. You chose everything except the truth. That part was mine to find." As he raised the remote for another devastating click, I realized that this night, which should have been the pinnacle of my professional success, had become something else entirely. It had become the night when all my carefully constructed lies collapsed, revealed by the silent, unerring testimony of data that had been tracking me all along. The spotlight still shone on me, but now it felt like an interrogation lamp, exposing every deceit I had woven into the fabric of our marriage. And James, the man who had once looked at me with adoration, now regarded me as a stranger as he prepared to show everyone exactly who I really was. 6 months earlier, my life had been a masterclass in compartmentalization. I had been the Melissa who crushed quarterly targets at Vertex Solutions, the Melissa who volunteered at my daughter Emma's school, and the Melissa who maintained a picture-perfect marriage with James, my husband of 11 years. And then there had been the other Melissa, the one who had created elaborate cover stories for time spent away from home and office, the one who had purchased a separate phone, the one who had fallen for Daniel, the architectural photographer I'd met at a client's office opening the previous December. It had begun innocently enough. A chance encounter, a coffee to discuss potential collaboration on Vertex's new branding campaign. Then drinks, then dinner. Then everything else that followed when two people ignored all the barriers that should have kept them apart. I hadn't planned to become unfaithful. I had always judged women who cheated, viewing them as selfish, weak, or fundamentally flawed. Yet there I had been, creating elaborate alibis with a creativity that, had I applied it to my actual job, might have earned me that Crystal Award months earlier. "I'll be in Chicago next Tuesday and Wednesday," I had told James one evening in January as we'd prepared dinner in our Beacon Hill brownstone. "The Apex team wants an in-person strategy session." James had been chopping vegetables, the knife making a steady rhythm against the cutting board. "Both nights? Can't you fly back after the meeting?" "They've scheduled 2 full days," I had replied, the lie flowing smoothly. "Besides, it makes more sense to stay over than to rush back for just a few hours at home." He had nodded, accepting my logic as he always did. James had been the perfect husband, supportive, intelligent, and trusting to a fault. His software development company had given him flexibility to be home more often for Emma, and he had never complained about my increasingly demanding travel schedule. "Do you want me to forward your itinerary to my calendar?" he had asked, something he'd started doing years earlier to keep our family's schedule synchronized. "Already did it," I had answered, knowing I'd sent a carefully edited version that matched my cover story, but not my actual plans. That particular Chicago trip had actually been an overnight stay with Daniel at a hotel just 45 minutes outside Boston. Close enough to return quickly if there had been a family emergency, far enough that I wouldn't encounter anyone who knew me. I had even created fake email confirmations from airlines and hotels, routing them to a folder where James could find them if he ever became suspicious. If you'd like to see more stories like this, please consider subscribing to my channel. The deception had required constant vigilance. I'd stored Daniel's contact under Diane Apex Marketing in my work phone. I'd purchased a second personal phone that stayed hidden in my car's glove compartment. I'd made sure to take actual business trips to the cities I'd later use as covers, so I could describe real restaurants, real hotel lobbies, real taxi routes from airports. "How was Chicago?" James had asked when I'd returned from that first fabricated trip. "Productive," I had replied, launching into details about meetings that never happened, with people who existed but whom I'd never actually seen. The client is difficult, but I think we made progress. They ordered Giordano's for lunch. You know how much I love their deep dish pizza. Did you bring me back a souvenir? Emma had asked, climbing onto my lap as I'd unpacked. The question had caught me off guard. I hadn't thought to maintain that part of our routine. I always brought her small gifts from my travels. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry," I had stammered. "The meetings ran so late, and then my morning flight was so early." "It's okay," she had said, clearly disappointed, but trying not to show it. "Next time?" "Definitely next time," I had promised, feeling the first real stab of guilt. That night, I had ordered a small Chicago snow globe online, paying extra for next-day shipping. When it had arrived, I had slipped it into my suitcase and found it the following evening. "Look what Mommy forgot was in her bag," I had announced, presenting it to Emma, whose face had lit up with joy. James had given me a curious look. "I thought you said you didn't have time to shop." "I grabbed it at the airport," I had replied quickly. "It was such a rush, I completely forgot I bought it." He had accepted this with a nod, though something in his eyes had made me wonder if I'd made my first mistake. As winter had turned to spring, my fictional business travel had increased. Daniel and I had spent weekends in Vermont, in the Berkshires, at coastal inns in Rhode Island and Maine. Each trip had required its own elaborate cover story. Each return had necessitated an encyclopedic memory for details I'd fabricated. Looking back, I can see how arrogant I had been. I had believed that because James had trusted me completely, he would continue to do so indefinitely. I had mistaken his respect for my privacy as a lack of curiosity. I had underestimated his intelligence and his instincts. What I hadn't known then was that James had begun to notice discrepancies as early as February. A credit card charge at a gas station in New Hampshire when I had supposedly been in Manhattan. A colleague mentioning they'd tried to reach me at a conference I'd claimed to attend. The Chicago snow globe with a manufacture date after my supposed trip. Small things, easily explained away. But James had been silently collecting these inconsistencies, saying nothing, watching everything. By March, I had become so confident in my deception that I had grown careless. I had stopped creating fake email confirmations. I had been less diligent about checking in from my locations. I had even used our shared credit card for a hotel room once, assuming James wouldn't check the statement before I could intercept it. All the while, I had continued to excel at work, securing 3 major new clients for Vertex Solutions. My boss had been thrilled, my team impressed by my seemingly boundless energy. No one had suspected that on the days I claimed to be working from home, I was often with Daniel. No one except James, who had been watching the GPS location data from my car with growing certainty that his wife had been living a double life. By April, I had mastered what I believed was the perfect system for my deception. My calendar had contained detailed, fabricated itineraries that I'd shared with both office and home. I had set up automatic social media posts that appeared to come from the cities where I'd claimed to be. I had even joined loyalty programs at hotel chains I never actually stayed at, just to receive emails I could reference in conversation. "Your Marriott status got upgraded," James had commented one evening as he'd scrolled through our shared email. "That's a lot of stays." "All those client trips are finally paying off," I had replied, not missing a beat. "Maybe we should use my points for a family vacation this summer." He had smiled and agreed, and I had felt a surge of satisfaction at how easily he'd accepted my explanation. It had reinforced my growing belief that I was too clever to get caught, that I had created an airtight alternate reality. The Toronto conference was exhausting, I had told my team after returning from what had actually been a weekend with Daniel in a lakeside cabin in Maine. 3 days of presentations and networking events. "Did you try that restaurant I recommended?" my assistant had asked. I had been prepared. "The one with the amazing maple-glazed salmon?" "Absolutely." "You were right. Best meal of the trip." I had researched the restaurant extensively online, memorizing menu items and interior descriptions. I'd even saved photos from their website to my phone, as if I'd taken them myself. These small victories had fed my confidence. Each successful lie had built upon the previous one, creating a house of cards that had seemed increasingly stable to my self-deluded mind. In May, Daniel and I had spent 3 days at a luxury resort in the Berkshires. I had told James and my office that I was attending an industry summit in Denver. The summit had been real. I had even registered for it, receiving all the official emails and updates. I simply hadn't gone. The altitude gave me a headache the whole time, I had complained to James afterward. But the keynote speakers were worth it. I made some great connections for the agency. "Did you remember to drink extra water?" he had asked, concerned. "That always helps me when we visit my brother in Colorado." "Not enough, apparently," I had replied, touched by his concern, even as I had inwardly congratulated myself on another convincing performance. That night, as James had slept beside me, I had reflected on how much easier the deception had become. What had started as nerve-wracking and guilt-inducing had evolved into something that had felt almost like a game. The elaborate planning, the careful cover stories, the thrill of getting away with it, all of it had become intoxicating in its own way. With Daniel, I had been a different version of myself. Not the responsible mother, not the driven executive, not the devoted wife, just Melissa, free from expectations and responsibilities. Our time together had existed in a bubble, disconnected from reality. "We should go to the Canary Islands next," he had suggested during our Berkshires weekend. "I have a photography assignment there in August. You could say it's an international client meeting." "James might question that," I had replied. "International travel is a bigger deal than domestic." "You've managed everything else perfectly," Daniel had said, kissing my shoulder. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." His confidence in my ability to deceive had pleased me then. Now I recognize it for what it was, a red flag I had willfully ignored. The following week, I had been working late at the office when my boss had stopped by my desk. "That Denver summit seems to have energized you," she had remarked. "Brad Williams from Eastridge Marketing was just telling me about the panel you participated in. Said you made some interesting points about digital integration." My blood had run cold. I hadn't been on any panel. I hadn't even been in Denver. But Brad Williams was a real person who had really attended the summit. "Oh, it wasn't a formal panel," I had improvised quickly. "Just a roundtable discussion after one of the sessions. I'm surprised Brad remembered it." My boss had nodded, apparently satisfied, and moved on. But the close call had shaken me. For the first time, I had realized that my web of lies had connections I couldn't control. That evening, I had searched for Brad Williams online, relieved to discover he was based in Seattle and unlikely to cross paths with anyone from my Boston office again. Still, the incident had left me unsettled. Not unsettled enough to end things with Daniel, however. The following weekend, we had met at an upscale hotel in Providence. I had told James I was doing site visits for a potential client event. "Just overnight," I had assured him. "I'll be back tomorrow in time for Emma's soccer game." What I hadn't known was that James had already begun to unravel my deceptions. While I had been crafting stories about Denver panels and Providence site visits, he had been quietly accessing data that told a very different story. My car's GPS system, linked to an account we had shared since purchase, had been recording my actual movements for months. James had said nothing. He had asked normal questions, expressed appropriate interest in my fabricated experiences, and maintained the appearance of a trusting husband. All while methodically gathering evidence that would later destroy the elaborate fantasy world I had constructed. In June, my confidence had reached its peak. Daniel and I had taken our boldest risk yet, a 4-day trip to a secluded rental house in Vermont. I had told James it was an intensive workshop in Philadelphia, followed by client meetings. 4 days is a long time, he had observed as I had packed. It's an important opportunity, I had replied. The agency is positioning for a major expansion, and this workshop is where the strategies will be developed. He had nodded thoughtfully. Will your cell reception be good? Emma has her dance recital on Thursday, and she wants to FaceTime to show you her costume. Should be fine, I had assured him. I'll make sure to be available. On Thursday evening, I had excused myself from dinner with Daniel, claiming I needed to make a work call. Instead, I had FaceTimed with Emma from the rental house's bathroom, carefully angling the camera to show only a generic white wall behind me. You look beautiful, sweetheart, I had told her as she had twirled in her sparkly costume. I wish I could be there. Daddy's recording the whole thing, she had said, and Grandma and Grandpa are coming. That's wonderful, I had replied, feeling a pang of guilt that had quickly subsided. I can't wait to watch it when I get home. After the call, Daniel had poured me another glass of wine. Everything okay at home? Perfect, I had answered, believing it completely. I hadn't realized that during that call, James had been watching me closely through the screen, noting the unfamiliar bathroom fixtures that certainly weren't from any Philadelphia hotel chain. I hadn't noticed him taking screenshots of our video chat, adding them to his growing file of evidence. I had returned home from Vermont feeling invincible. I had regaled James with fictional stories about Philadelphia, secure in my belief that my double life would continue undiscovered. I had even been bold enough to suggest we plan a real family trip in July after my anticipated award ceremony. Let's go somewhere special to celebrate, I had proposed. Just the three of us. That sounds perfect, James had agreed, his eyes revealing nothing of what he already knew. I think we're due for some honest family time together. The irony of his word choice had completely escaped me then. I had been too blinded by my own success at deception to recognize that my house of cards had already begun to collapse. The first hint that my carefully constructed facade was crumbling came in late June, when I returned from what I had claimed was a 2-day client retreat in Baltimore. In reality, Daniel and I had spent the time at a beachfront hotel in Cape Cod. James had been unusually quiet when I'd arrived home. He had helped with my luggage, asked perfunctory questions about my trip, but his usual warmth had been missing. Is everything okay? I had asked as we'd prepared dinner. Just tired, he had replied, not meeting my eyes. Emma had a stomachache last night. We were up late. You should have called me, I had said, feeling a genuine surge of maternal concern. I did, he had answered, his voice carefully neutral. Twice, it went straight to voicemail. A cold sensation had crawled up my spine. I had turned off my primary phone during time with Daniel, using only my secret second phone. There should have been no reason for James to suspect anything from missed calls. Poor reception was a common enough excuse, but something in his tone had made me uneasy. The reception at the retreat center must have been terrible, I had offered. I didn't see any missed calls this morning. James had merely nodded, returning to chopping vegetables with methodical precision. The conversation had moved on, but the moment had lingered in my mind. The following week, I had been working from home when James had called unexpectedly from his office. Hey, quick question, he had said, his voice casual. What was the name of that marketing consultant you met with in Chicago back in February? The one from Apex? My heart had raced. There had been no marketing consultant because there had been no Chicago trip. I had scrambled to remember the details of my fabricated story. Robert, I had said after a moment's hesitation. Robert Keller, I think. Why? Just ran into someone at a networking event who mentioned working with Apex, James had replied. Thought it might be the same person. After we'd hung up, I had immediately searched for Robert Keller Apex Marketing Chicago online, desperate to see if such a person existed. To my relief, I had found a LinkedIn profile that matched closely enough. I had studied it carefully, memorizing details in case James asked follow-up questions. What I hadn't known was that there had been no networking event, no mention of Apex. James had been testing me, noting my hesitation, adding another piece to his growing collection of evidence. By early July, the atmosphere at home had changed subtly. James had asked more specific questions about my work trips. He had suggested joining me on one if schedules aligned. He had mentioned casually how his company had updated their vehicle tracking software and how impressive the accuracy had become. "It's amazing what data can tell you now," he had remarked one evening as we'd watched television. "Locations, duration of stays, routes taken, all stored and accessible with a few clicks." I had murmured agreement, not realizing he had been describing exactly how he had been tracking my movements for months. Then came the receipt. I had been emptying my purse when a small paper had fluttered to the floor. James had picked it up before I could react. "Newport Harbor Inn," he had read aloud, his voice carefully controlled. "From 2 weeks ago." The blood had drained from my face. It had been from my most recent rendezvous with Daniel, a careless mistake to keep the receipt, an even worse one to leave it in my everyday purse. "Oh, that," I had said, snatching it from his hand with forced casualness. "Diane from Apex and I had lunch there when I was in Rhode Island for that coastal properties client. I told you about that trip." "You told me you were in Hartford that day," he had replied, his eyes never leaving my face. "Hartford was the day before," I had corrected quickly. "Then Rhode Island, remember? I said the schedule had changed." He had stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Right, the schedule change." That night, I had lain awake beside him, my mind racing. Had I actually told him about a schedule change? Had I mentioned Rhode Island at all? My lies had become so numerous, so intricate, that I had begun to lose track of them. The next morning, I had called Daniel in a panic. "We need to be more careful," I had whispered from my car in the office parking garage. "James found a receipt from Newport." "Did he suspect anything?" Daniel had asked. "I don't think so," I had replied. I explained it away, but it was close. "Maybe we should cool things for a while," he had suggested. "At least until after your award ceremony." The suggestion had irritated me. "Are you worried about us getting caught, or about not having access to me for a few weeks?" "That's not fair," he had protested. "I'm thinking about both of us." We had argued briefly before agreeing to one more weekend together, before cooling things until after the Boston Marketing Association event. That weekend had been in early July, at an upscale hotel in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I had told James I needed to visit our satellite office in Manchester for quarterly reviews. "Will you be staying overnight?" he had asked. "Just a day trip," I had replied. "I should be home for dinner." What I hadn't expected was that James would call the satellite office looking for me late that afternoon. "Strange," he had said when I'd returned home that evening. "I tried reaching you at the Manchester office around 3, but they said you weren't there." My mind had raced for an explanation. "We finished early, so I stopped to do some shopping on the way back." "Did you need something urgent?" "Emma's school called. She had a slight fever. I picked her up, but thought you might want to know right away." The genuine concern in his voice had made my deception feel even worse. "Is she okay?" "She's fine now. Tylenol brought the fever down." He had studied my face carefully. "Did you find anything good while shopping?" "Just browsed, really," I had answered quickly. "Nothing worth buying." He had nodded, then said, "No bags in your car. I checked when I heard you pull in. Thought I might help you carry things." The observation had sent another wave of panic through me. James had never checked my car when I arrived home before. Had he been looking for evidence? Had he seen something else? "I didn't say I bought anything," I had replied, an edge creeping into my voice. "I said I went shopping." "Of course," he had agreed mildly. "My mistake." That night, after James and Emma had gone to bed, I had searched frantically through my purse and car for any other incriminating evidence. I had deleted text messages, cleared browser histories, and double-checked my calendar to ensure all my fake appointments aligned with the stories I had told. What I hadn't realized was how thoroughly James had already documented my deceptions. While I had been removing evidence, he had been consolidating his GPS data, screenshots, credit card statements, phone records he had accessed as the joint account holder, even conversations with my assistant about my actual whereabouts during claimed business trips. A week before the awards ceremony, James had suggested we have dinner at our favorite restaurant. To celebrate your upcoming award, he had explained. A private celebration before the public one. The evening had been pleasant, almost like old times. James had been attentive, interested in my work, affectionate in a way he hadn't been for weeks. My earlier concerns had faded as we'd shared a bottle of wine and reminisced about our early days together. "Remember our third date?" he had asked, reaching across the table to take my hand. "When we got caught in that thunderstorm in the public garden?" I had smiled at the memory. We were soaked by the time we made it to the restaurant. The maitre d' wanted to turn us away, but you charmed him into giving us a table anyway. "I can be persuasive when I need to be," I had replied. "Yes," he had agreed, something shifting in his expression. "You've always been good at getting people to believe what you want them to believe." The comment had hung between us, loaded with potential meaning, but his smile had remained in place, and the moment had passed as he'd raised his glass in a toast. "To your success," he had said, and to the truth finally coming to light. I had clinked my glass against his, not understanding that his words had been a preview of what was to come. 3 days before the awards ceremony, I had noticed James spending unusual amounts of time in his home office with the door closed. Twice I had entered to find him quickly minimizing windows on his computer screen. "Working on something interesting?" I had asked. "Just a presentation," he had replied, "for a potential client." I had accepted the explanation without question, never imagining that the presentation he had been perfecting was designed to expose my double life in the most public way possible. The morning of the awards ceremony had dawned bright and clear. I had been filled with anticipation, not just for the professional recognition, but because I had believed my careful balancing act had succeeded. The close calls of recent weeks had made me more cautious, more attentive to details. I had convinced myself that any suspicions James might have harbored had been successfully dispelled. "Nervous about tonight?" he had asked as we'd had breakfast. "A little," I had admitted. "It's a big deal to be recognized like this." "You've certainly put in the work," he had said, his tone unreadable. "Everyone will finally see exactly what you've been doing." If only I had recognized the warning in his words. If only I had understood that while I had been constructing my elaborate deceptions, James had been building something far more powerful, a case against me, meticulously documented and irrefutable, which he had prepared to present to an audience of everyone who mattered in my life. The Wentworth Ballroom had glowed with soft lighting that July evening as 200 of Boston's marketing elite gathered for the annual awards ceremony. Round tables draped in white linen had filled the space, each decorated with elegant centerpieces of blue hydrangeas and white roses. The stage had been set with a podium and large projection screen, ready for the evening's presentations and accolades. Our table had been positioned prominently near the front, a place of honor for award recipients. James had sat beside me, looking handsome and composed in his navy suit. My parents had been there too, my father distinguished with his silver hair, my mother elegant in a burgundy dress she had purchased specially for the occasion. My boss, Diana, and several colleagues from Vertex Solutions had completed our table of 8. "You look beautiful tonight," James had whispered as we'd taken our seats. "Everyone should see you exactly as you are." I had smiled at what I had taken as a compliment, smoothing the fabric of my black cocktail dress. "Thank you for being here. It means everything to have you by my side." He had simply nodded, his expression unreadable as he had reached down to ensure his laptop bag was secure beside his chair. The evening had progressed through dinner and preliminary awards. Wine had flowed, conversation had been animated, and the atmosphere had been celebratory. When the association president had announced the Executive of the Year award, my colleagues had squeezed my arm in excitement as I had made my way to the stage. The Crystal Award had been heavy in my hands, the applause gratifying. I had given my prepared remarks, thanking my team and acknowledging James's support. That was when everything had changed. The screen behind me had illuminated with the map, my car's GPS data displayed for all to see. As James had approached the stage with deliberate steps, a hush had fallen over the room. "For those who don't know me," he had said, addressing the crowd, "I'm James Harrington, Melissa's husband of 11 years. I'm here to add some context to tonight's celebration." He had clicked the remote, and the map had zoomed in on the first location, the hotel in Rhode Island from February. On February 12th, while Melissa was supposedly at a client meeting in Chicago, her car spent 18 hours parked at the Newport Harbor Inn. Room registered to Melissa Stevens, her maiden name. Gasps had rippled through the audience. I had reached for the remote, but James had stepped away. "James, please," I had whispered. "Not here." He had ignored me, clicking to the next slide. March 3rd through 5th. Claimed location, industry conference in Albany. Actual location, lakeside cabins in the Berkshires. With each new slide, with each new revelation, my professional reputation and personal life had disintegrated before my eyes. James had been methodical, his voice steady as he had detailed my movements over 6 months, contrasting each with the story I had told him. May 18th, claimed location, Denver Industry Summit. Actual location, Green Mountain Resort, Vermont. Interesting fact, she allegedly participated in a panel discussion at the summit, according to a conversation her boss had with an attendee. He had turned to Diana, whose face had shown stunned realization. The panel never happened because Melissa was never there. My parents' expressions had been devastating to witness. My father had stared at his plate, unable to look at the evidence of my betrayal. My mother's eyes had filled with tears, her hand clutching my father's arm as if for support. "Stop this," I had finally managed to say, my voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is completely inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" James had repeated, turning to face me directly. "You want to talk about what's inappropriate?" He had clicked again, and the screen had displayed text messages between me and Daniel, captured from our company's cloud backup that James had somehow accessed through our IT director, Michael, who had been a close friend of his for years. "May 24th, James had read aloud. "Can't wait to feel your hands on me again. 3 more days until Philadelphia." The quotation marks around Philadelphia were a nice touch, don't you think? The room had gone completely silent. My colleagues had stared in shock, some looking away in embarrassment at the private nature of the messages now made public. "If you want to see a more blatant example of someone lying to all of you, hit that like button," James had said to the crowd, his voice taking on an edge. "Because there's more." He had clicked again, and hotel receipts had appeared on screen, dozens of them, each with dates corresponding to my supposed business trips, each showing room charges, room service orders for 2, and in some cases, spa services. June 7th. While allegedly attending critical client meetings in Hartford, Melissa and her companion, whom I'll leave unnamed out of more courtesy than I was shown, enjoyed a couple's massage at the Ocean View Resort in Newport, charged to our joint credit card. I had stood frozen on stage, the Crystal Award still clutched in my hands, as James had systematically dismantled every alibi, every cover story I had created. The evidence had been overwhelming, presented with the precision of someone who had spent months gathering and organizing it. July 2nd, he had continued, displaying a screenshot from my daughter's FaceTime call. "Melissa told Emma and me she was at a workshop in Philadelphia. Note the fixtures in this bathroom background." The next slide had shown promotional photos from a rental property in Vermont with identical fixtures. "I called the workshop organizers in Philadelphia," James had added. Not only was Melissa not in attendance, but she had canceled her registration 3 weeks earlier, with a refund sent to an account I wasn't aware existed. My boss had risen from her seat then. "James, I think—" "I'm almost finished, Diana," he had interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "I believe in transparency, and I think everyone here deserves to know exactly who they're celebrating tonight." The final slide had been the most damning, a composite of all my movements over 6 months, contrasted with my claimed locations. The pattern of deception had been undeniable, laid out in stark digital evidence. While Vertex Solutions has been celebrating Melissa's exceptional work bringing in new clients, James had said, addressing my colleagues directly. You might be interested to know that several of those client meetings never actually occurred. The Eastridge account she secured in April? She claimed to spend 3 days in New York negotiating that deal. In reality, she was at a cabin in Maine with her companion. My boss's expression had shifted from embarrassment to concern, then to anger as the professional implications had become clear. That's not true, I had managed to say, finding my voice at last. The Eastridge deal was legitimate. All my work has been legitimate. Parts of it, perhaps, James had conceded. Just like parts of our marriage were legitimate. But I think everyone here now understands that with Melissa, it's impossible to separate truth from fiction. He had turned to face me fully then, and I had seen not just anger in his eyes, but profound hurt. For months, I watched you lie to my face every day, he had said, his voice finally betraying emotion. I listened to you fabricate entire experiences, entire days of your life. I watched you come home and hug our daughter after being with him, never missing a beat, never showing a moment of guilt. The mention of Emma had been too much. Tears had begun streaming down my face. James, please. We can talk about this at home. We had a home, he had replied. You broke it. Just like you're breaking down right now, not because you're sorry, but because you got caught. He had turned back to the audience, many of whom had been shifting uncomfortably in their seats, caught in a marital implosion none of them had anticipated witnessing that evening. I apologize for disrupting your celebration, he had said, but I believe in honesty, in transparency, and in consequences. For 6 months I've lived with the knowledge of my wife's deception, gathering evidence while she thought she was too clever to be caught. Tonight seemed an appropriate time for the truth to be acknowledged, given the public nature of her achievements. With that, he had placed the remote on the podium and walked off the stage, stopping briefly at our table to collect his jacket and laptop bag. My parents had avoided his eyes, but as he had passed my mother, she had reached out and squeezed his hand in a gesture of support that had felt like another betrayal. I had remained on stage, Crystal Award still in my grip, as whispers had rippled through the crowd. The association president had approached cautiously, clearly unsure how to proceed. Perhaps we should take a short break, he had suggested gently, attempting to guide me toward the steps. I had pulled away from his touch. He's lying, I had said loudly, desperately. This is some kind of twisted revenge fantasy, a misunderstanding. But even as I had spoken the words, the evidence had remained displayed on the screen behind me, irrefutable, detailed, and devastating. No one in that room had believed me. Not my colleagues, not my boss, not my parents, and certainly not myself. If this revelation of truth and lies makes you feel strongly, please hit that like button. In that moment, standing alone on stage with 200 pairs of eyes witnessing my humiliation, I had finally understood what James had been doing for months. While I had been constructing elaborate lies, he had been building an airtight case. While I had been covering my tracks, he had been documenting them. While I had been living in an illusion of control, he had been patiently waiting for the perfect moment to shatter that illusion completely. The Crystal Award, meant to represent the pinnacle of my professional success, had felt like a mockery in my hands, as hollow and transparent as the life I had been living. The next 30 minutes had been a blur of shame and desperate attempts to salvage what remained of my dignity. After James's devastating presentation, the award ceremony had dissolved into chaos. Some guests had departed immediately, unwilling to remain for the uncomfortable aftermath. Others had lingered, their expressions a mix of shock, pity, and, most humiliating of all, fascination at witnessing such a public downfall. The association president had quickly called for an intermission, cutting the audio to my microphone as I had tried to defend myself from the stage. My boss Diana had approached, her face a mask of professional concern that hadn't quite hidden her personal disappointment. "Melissa," she had said quietly, taking my elbow to guide me away from the curious onlookers. Let's go somewhere private to talk. She had led me to a small conference room adjacent to the ballroom where my parents had joined us moments later. My mother's eyes had been red-rimmed, my father's face ashen. Is it true? Diana had asked once the door closed behind us. The Eastridge account, were you actually in meetings with them when you claimed to be? Of all the revelations that evening, it had been telling that her first question concerned the professional implications rather than the personal ones. Yes, I had insisted, seizing on one truth among the many lies. Every client meeting happened. Every deal is legitimate. I would never compromise my work. Just your marriage, my father had said quietly, speaking for the first time since the public exposure. His words had stung more sharply than anything James had said on stage. Dad, it's not what it looked like, I had begun, the defense sounding hollow even to my own ears. He's twisting things, taking normal business travel and making it seem suspicious. Stop it, Melissa, my mother had interrupted, her voice uncharacteristically harsh. We saw the evidence. Everyone saw it. Those weren't business trips. Some of them were, I had insisted, clinging to partial truths. Yes, I met someone. Yes, I made some poor decisions. But James is making it seem worse than it was. Diana had pinched the bridge of her nose, clearly calculating the professional damage. The Denver summit, were you there or not? I had hesitated too long before answering. Not physically, no, but I participated remotely in some sessions. After telling me and the entire office you were there in person, Diana had clarified, after claiming to be on a panel that never existed. I covered all my responsibilities, I had said defensively. Every project was delivered on time. Every client was satisfied. Except your family, my father had interjected. Diana had raised a hand to stop the conversation from derailing further. Melissa, I'm not concerned about your personal life right now. I'm concerned about the integrity of our agency. If clients discover you fabricated business trips, I didn't fabricate the work, I had interrupted. Just the locations. And expense reports? Diana had asked pointedly. Hotel stays in cities you never visited? Flights you never took? My silence had been answer enough. We'll need to discuss your position at Vertex when we're back in the office, she had said, her tone making it clear what that discussion would entail. For now, I suggest you deal with your personal situation. She had left the room, closing the door firmly behind her. I had turned to my parents, desperate for some support. Mom, Dad, you know me. You know I wouldn't what? My mother had cut in. Wouldn't lie to your husband for months? Wouldn't betray your family? Wouldn't humiliate yourself professionally? Because from what we just saw, you did all of those things. James had no right to expose this publicly, I had protested. He could have confronted me privately. Would you have admitted it? My father had asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. Or would you have continued lying like you've been doing for months? His question had struck at the core of my self-deception. Would I have confessed if James had confronted me without evidence? The truth, which I hadn't been ready to admit even to myself, was that I likely would have denied everything, crafting new lies to cover the old ones. I made mistakes, I had acknowledged, tears welling again. But destroying my career, humiliating me in front of my colleagues, that's cruel. What you did to James was cruel, my mother had replied. What you did to Emma was cruel. Actions have consequences, Melissa. You're just facing yours. They had left shortly after, my father muttering something about checking on Emma, who had been staying with a neighbor during the ceremony. Their departure had felt like another blow, my own parents choosing James's side over mine. Left alone in the conference room, I had tried to formulate a strategy. The professional damage might be containable. I could claim personal issues had led to poor judgment about my whereabouts, but that my work had remained uncompromised. The personal damage, however, had seemed irreparable. The look in James's eyes as he had methodically exposed my deceptions had told me everything I needed to know about the state of our marriage. After composing myself as best I could, I had returned to the ballroom, which had largely emptied by then. A few colleagues had remained, awkwardly gathering their belongings. The Crystal Award had been placed on our table, no longer a source of pride, but a monument to my hubris. I had collected my purse and jacket, avoiding eye contact with those still present. As I had turned to leave, Michael from IT had approached, his expression grim. "You should know," he had said quietly. "James came to me weeks ago with concerns about your travel claims versus your actual whereabouts. Company policy required me to investigate when he suggested expense report discrepancies." "You helped him," I had realized aloud. The text messages from the company cloud, the emails. Michael had shrugged unapologetically. He had enough evidence already from the GPS data. I just confirmed what he suspected about the business side of things. The company has protocols for suspected financial improprieties. "I didn't steal from the company," I had hissed. "Claiming expenses for locations you never visited is theft, Melissa," he had replied simply before walking away. I had driven home in a fog of shock and denial, rehearsing explanations, justifications, anything that might mitigate the damage. But with each passing mile, the reality had become clearer. There was no defense against the truth James had presented. When I had arrived at our brownstone, the lights had been on, but the house silent. I had found James in the kitchen, calmly packing food into Emma's lunchbox for the following day. "Where's Emma?" I had asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "At my sister's," he had replied without looking up. "I thought it best she not be here for this conversation." "You had no right," I had begun, anger finally breaking through the shock. "No right to humiliate me like that." James had closed the lunchbox and finally turned to face me. "You gave up your right to privacy when you chose to lie to me, to our daughter, and apparently to your entire company for half a year." "I made mistakes," I had admitted, attempting a more conciliatory approach. "I got lost, confused, but what you did tonight was calculated cruelty." "No," he had replied calmly. "What I did tonight was finally stop enabling your deceptions. For months, I watched you lie without consequence. I gathered evidence while hoping, praying, there might be some explanation besides the obvious. There wasn't. We could have discussed this privately," I had insisted. "Worked through it with a counselor, found a path forward." "Is that what you want?" he had asked, studying my face carefully. "A path forward? Together?" For a moment, I had seen a flicker of the old James, the man who had loved me unconditionally, who had supported my career, who had been my partner in building our life together. "Yes," I had whispered, reaching for his hand. "We have 11 years together, a daughter, a home. We can get through this." He had allowed me to take his hand, but his eyes had remained cool, assessing. "If that's true, then tell me everything, right now. No more lies, no more evasions. Who is he? How long? How many times?" Put on the spot, I had hesitated. Even then, even after everything had been exposed, my instinct had been to minimize, to shape the truth into something less damning. "It's complicated," I had begun. James had pulled his hand away, shaking his head in disgust. "Still lying, even now." "I'm not lying," I had protested. "I'm trying to explain." "Then explain," he had challenged. "Tell me exactly how many times you met him. Tell me when it started. Tell me every location, every lie you told to cover it." I had struggled to organize the tangled web of deceptions into a coherent narrative. "It started in December, after the Meridian office opening. His name is Daniel. He's a photographer." "And?" James had prompted when I had fallen silent. "We met, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 times," I had admitted reluctantly. 27, James had corrected. "I have the GPS data for all of them, the hotel receipts for 22, the credit card charges that align with each date." The precision of his accounting had been chilling. While I had been reveling in what I had thought was the perfect deception, he had been documenting every single betrayal. "What do you want from me, James?" I had asked, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming me. To grovel? To beg forgiveness? Will that satisfy whatever need for revenge drove you to destroy me publicly tonight? "I don't want anything from you anymore," he had replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "That's the point you're missing. Tonight wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. For 6 months you lived a lie and expected me to accept it. Tonight, I chose not to accept it anymore." "So what happens now?" I had asked, gesturing vaguely around our kitchen at the life we had built together. James had reached into his pocket and removed a folded document, placing it on the counter between us. "Divorce papers," he had said simply. "Already filed. You'll be served officially tomorrow, but I thought you should know tonight." The finality of it had hit me like a physical blow. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain, to make amends." "You had 6 months of chances," he had replied. "Every time you looked me in the eye and lied about where you'd been. Every time you kissed our daughter goodnight after being with him. Every single day was a chance to tell the truth, and you chose deception instead." His words had cut through my remaining defenses. For the first time that night, I had begun to truly see my actions through his eyes, not as exciting adventures or justified escapes, but as calculated betrayals of the man who had trusted me completely. "I'm sorry," I had whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. "I believe you are," James had replied, "but not for what you did. You're sorry you got caught." With that, he had turned away, indicating that our conversation, like our marriage, was over. The following morning had arrived with a crushing sense of finality. I had spent the night in our guest room, sleep eluding me as I had replayed the events of the previous evening. The public humiliation, the loss of professional respect, the disappointment in my parents' eyes, and most significantly, the cold certainty in James's voice when he had placed those divorce papers on our kitchen counter. I had awoken to an empty house and the mechanical ping of my phone receiving messages. 27 missed calls, 43 text messages, 16 emails. My professional and personal worlds had been imploding simultaneously, and everyone had wanted responses I hadn't been prepared to give. Among the messages had been one from Daniel, sent at 11:30 the previous night. "Is everything okay? You haven't responded all evening." He hadn't known. He had been the accomplice in my deception, yet completely unaware of its unraveling. I hadn't bothered to reply. A text from James had arrived as I'd been scrolling through the digital aftermath. "Meeting at office, 12 noon. Bring your lawyer if you want. Final conversation before I take Emma to my sister's for the week." His office. Neutral territory. I had dressed carefully in a navy suit, professional, controlled, appropriate for facing whatever came next. The divorce papers had remained untouched on the kitchen counter, a physical manifestation of my failures that I hadn't been ready to acknowledge. James's software development company had occupied 3 floors of a renovated warehouse in Seaport. His assistant's face had been carefully blank as she had escorted me to the conference room where he had been waiting. Not his private office, a space visible to his employees through glass walls. Another public setting for what should have been an intensely private conversation. "Thank you for coming," he had said formally as I had entered, as if I had been any business associate and not his wife of 11 years. "Did I have a choice?" I had asked, taking a seat across from him at the large table. "You've had nothing but choices, Melissa," he had replied evenly. "And you made them all." A laptop had sat open before him. My stomach had clenched at the sight, remembering how his computer had been the instrument of my public undoing the night before. "If you're planning another presentation of my failures, I'd rather you just say what you need to say," I had told him, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "No presentations," he had assured me. "Just one final piece of information you should have before you decide how to proceed with the divorce." He had turned the laptop toward me. On screen had been an email thread, not mine, but Daniel's. Communications with a client from 3 months earlier, discussing a photography project for a major competitor of Vertex Solutions. "I don't understand," I had said, scanning the messages. What does Daniel's work have to do with anything? Keep reading, James had instructed. As I had scrolled, the true nature of the exchange had become clear. Daniel had been asking specific questions about Vertex's upcoming campaigns, about client relationships, about marketing strategies, information that would have been valuable to a competitor, information that I had access to, information that I had potentially revealed during our time together. I never discussed confidential work matters with him, I had said immediately, the denial automatic. Are you certain? James had asked. Because his client seems very pleased with the insights he provided, insights that align remarkably well with confidential strategy documents you had access to. Cold fear had replaced indignation. You're implying industrial espionage. That's absurd. Is it? James had pulled out a folder and placed several printed photographs on the table. These were taken from Daniel's cloud storage. Michael helped recover them after finding suspicious emails on the company server. The photos had shown pages from Vertex's confidential marketing strategy. Documents that had been in my possession, documents that had been visible in the background of what appeared to be casual photos taken in hotel rooms I recognized all too well. He photographed your work materials while you weren't looking, James had explained, his voice clinically detached. Sometimes while you were sleeping, sometimes while you were in the shower, very methodical. I didn't know, I had whispered, the full implication hitting me. I never gave him information deliberately. Perhaps not, James had conceded, but your poor judgment created the opportunity. Your affair wasn't just a personal betrayal. It compromised your professional responsibilities in ways you didn't even realize. He had let the statement hang in the air as I had stared at the evidence before me. Not only had I destroyed my marriage, but I had potentially facilitated corporate espionage. My career, already damaged by the previous night's revelations, would be utterly ruined if this information became public. Does Diana know about this? I had asked, referring to my boss. Not yet, James had replied. That decision is yours to make. I had looked up at him sharply. What do you mean? You have two options, he had explained calmly. Sign the divorce papers, agreeing to my terms regarding Emma's custody and our assets, and this information remains between us. Or contest the divorce, and I'll be forced to include this evidence in the proceedings, which would become a matter of public record. You're blackmailing me, I had realized, anger flaring briefly before being extinguished by the understanding that I had no moral high ground to stand on. I'm offering you a choice, James had corrected. The same courtesy you never extended to me when you decided to dismantle our marriage. He had been right, of course. Every deception, every lie, every betrayal had been my choice alone. And now I had been facing the consequences, compressed into one impossible decision. What are your terms? I had asked quietly, defeat evident in my voice. Primary physical custody of Emma remains with me. You get standard visitation. The house stays with me. Your retirement accounts remain yours. Mine remain mine. Everything else we divide equally. The terms had been fair, more than fair, given the circumstances and the additional leverage he had held. But surrendering primary custody of Emma had felt like having my heart physically extracted. She's my daughter, too, I had whispered. Yes, James had agreed, a flash of genuine emotion finally breaking through his controlled exterior. A daughter who deserves stability. Who deserves at least one parent she can trust completely. What would you do in James's position? Would you have offered the same terms, or would you have chosen a different path? Comment below with your thoughts. The truth in his words had been undeniable. For months, I had modeled deception for our child, coming home with fabricated stories, maintaining elaborate lies, betraying the foundation of our family while pretending everything was normal. What kind of example had that set? What damage had I already done to her understanding of honesty and integrity? I'll sign, I had said finally, the fight gone from me. But I want you to know, I really did love you, James. This wasn't about not loving you. I know, he had replied, and for the first time that day his voice had softened slightly. That's what makes it all so pointless. You destroyed something real for something that wasn't. He had slid the divorce papers across the table, along with a pen. Each page had been neatly flagged where my signature had been required, as methodical in ending our marriage as he had been in documenting my betrayal. I had signed each page without reading the details, trusting that James, unlike me, had been truthful about the terms. When I had finished, he had collected the papers without comment and closed his laptop. "What happens now?" I had asked, feeling adrift in the aftermath of such a definitive action. "Now," he had said, rising from his chair, "you rebuild your life. Without me. Without Emma as your full-time daughter. And hopefully, without the capacity for deception that brought us to this point." He had moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "I've already spoken with Daniel, by the way. Showed him the evidence that he was photographing your work materials. He claims he didn't realize the significance of what he was doing." "You contacted him?" I had asked, surprised. "I needed to understand if you were complicit in the corporate espionage," James had explained. "I believe you weren't. Small comfort, but there it is. A final mercy I hadn't deserved. His belief in my professional, if not personal, integrity." "James," I had called as he had reached the door. "I am sorry. Truly." He had paused, his hand on the doorknob. "The GPS never lies, even when you did, every single time." With those words, he had left the room, and I had known with absolute certainty that our marriage was irretrievably over. Not because of legal documents, but because the trust that had been its foundation had been systematically destroyed. By my choices, by my deceptions, by my arrogant belief that I could maintain two separate realities without consequences. In that moment of clarity, sitting alone in a glass-walled conference room with the evidence of my personal and professional failures spread before me, I had finally understood what James had known for months. Some betrayals can never be undone, and some lies change the truth forever. By December, 5 months after that devastating July night, my life had become unrecognizable from what it had been. The brownstone in Beacon Hill had been sold, James and Emma moving to a new home in Cambridge, while I had settled into a sterile apartment in Back Bay. The divorce had been finalized with remarkable speed, my lack of contest accelerating a process that could have dragged on for a year or more. My career at Vertex Solutions had ended the morning after the awards ceremony. Diana had called me into her office before I could even reach my desk, security personnel waiting discreetly in the hallway. "We need to make this quick and dignified," she had said, sliding a separation agreement across her desk. "Your access has already been revoked." I had signed without argument, knowing I had no defense against the professional breaches that had been exposed. Diana had been merciful enough not to mention the potential corporate espionage, whether because James had spoken to her or because she simply hadn't known. I never discovered. The Boston marketing community, once my professional home, had closed ranks against me, not with overt hostility, but with the quiet exclusion that effectively ended a career. No calls had been returned, no meetings granted, no opportunities extended. My award-winning campaigns had been quietly removed from Vertex's portfolio, my name excised from their client success stories. Daniel had disappeared from my life as quickly as he had entered it. His final message, sent the day after James had confronted him, had been brief. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I'm sorry." Whether he had meant the personal destruction, the professional compromise, or both, I hadn't cared enough to ask. My parents had maintained contact, but our relationship had been irreparably altered. Weekly dinners had become monthly phone calls, their disappointment a tangible presence even across the digital distance. They had remained close with James and saw Emma regularly, a continuity I had been grateful for, even as it had highlighted my own estrangement. Emma had been the most painful loss. Our weekends together had been awkward initially, neither of us knowing how to navigate our new reality. She had asked questions I hadn't been prepared to answer, her 8-year-old mind struggling to comprehend why her family had fractured so suddenly. "Did you and Daddy stop loving each other?" she had asked during one of our first visitations. "Sometimes adults make mistakes that hurt the people they love," I had replied, unable to offer a more honest explanation without burdening her with adult complexities. "But you still love me, right?" Her insecurity had been a knife to my heart. "Always and forever," I had assured her, holding her tightly and wondering if she could feel the desperate truth in my embrace. In November, I had found work with a small digital marketing firm in Providence, a significant step down professionally, but the only opportunity that had materialized after months of searching. The commute had been punishing, but it had offered a fresh start among people who hadn't witnessed my public humiliation. The crisp December afternoon, when everything had finally, irrevocably ended, had been bright and cold. I had been in Boston for my weekend with Emma, and we had planned to visit the holiday market at Faneuil Hall. As we had walked through the crowded marketplace, my daughter's mittened hand in mine, I had spotted them through the holiday shoppers, James and a woman I hadn't recognized, examining ornaments at one of the stalls. Emma had seen them too, her face lighting up. "Daddy!" she had called, pulling free from my grasp and running toward them. James had turned, lifting Emma into a hug before his eyes had found mine across the crowded space. The woman beside him had smiled warmly at my daughter, her hand resting casually on James's arm with the easy familiarity of established intimacy. I had approached slowly, the awkwardness of the situation inescapable. "I didn't know you'd be here," I had said, the words coming out more accusatory than intended. "Last-minute decision," James had replied, his tone neutral. "Emma mentioned you were coming, but we thought it would be crowded enough that—" He hadn't needed to finish the thought. That we wouldn't run into each other. That we could occupy the same space without intersection. That our lives had diverged so completely that even Boston had become large enough for both of us, provided we maintained our separate orbits. "Melissa, this is Caroline," he had said after a moment, basic courtesy winning out over discomfort. "Caroline, this is Emma's mother." Not my ex-wife, just Emma's mother. A definition rooted solely in biological fact rather than shared history. Caroline had offered her hand and a genuine smile. "It's nice to meet you. Emma talks about you all the time." I had shaken her hand automatically, studying her face for signs of judgment or triumph and finding none. Just warmth and the slight awkwardness of the situation. "We should probably get going," James had said, checking his watch. "We have tickets for the ice sculpture exhibition at 4. "Can Mommy come too?" Emma had asked, her innocent question hanging in the air like frost. The look James and I had exchanged had contained volumes. The impossibility of pretending at normalcy, the recognition of boundaries that could never again be crossed, the acknowledgement that our lives now moved along parallel tracks that might occasionally come into view but would never again intersect. "Mommy and I have plans for tomorrow, sweetie," I had said, smoothing her hair. "You go enjoy the ice sculptures with Daddy and Caroline." As James had set Emma down, he had leaned closer to me. "I never wanted it to end this way," he had said quietly, his words for me alone. "Despite everything." "I know," I had replied, and I had. The cruelty of the public revelation had never been his goal, only the finality of truth after months of deception. I had watched them walk away, Emma between them, her hands held by both James and Caroline, her laughter carrying back to me through the holiday crowds. They had looked like a family, not the family I had destroyed, but a new configuration built on the ruins of what had come before. Standing alone amid the festive bustle, I had finally accepted what I had been resisting for months. Some endings were truly final. Some mistakes could not be unmade. Some paths, once taken, led irreversibly away from the life I had once known. As I had turned to leave, a text had arrived from my new boss in Providence. "Great news. Client approved the campaign. Your fresh start is paying off." A fresh start. Perhaps that had been the only possible way forward. Not a return to what was lost, but the slow, painful construction of something new from the wreckage of my own making. The snow had begun to fall as I had walked back to my car, covering the city in a blank white canvas. James and Emma had disappeared into the crowd, moving toward their future, while I had been left to create mine. The finality had been absolute, the separation complete. The life I had carelessly discarded was gone forever, replaced by consequences I would carry forward into whatever came next. The GPS never lies, even when you did, every single time. James's final words to me that day in his office had contained the perfect distillation of my failure. I had believed I could navigate between truth and deception without consequences. I had thought myself clever enough to maintain parallel realities. I had trusted technology to record my movements while forgetting it would also record my lies. In the end, the truth had found its way to the surface, as it inevitably does. Not through confession or courage on my part, but through the patient, methodical documentation of a man who had deserved far better than the betrayal I had offered him. As I had driven away from Boston that evening, leaving my daughter to her holiday celebration with the father who had remained true when I had not, I had finally understood that some stories don't offer redemption or second chances. Some stories simply end, leaving nothing but the hope that somewhere in the future I might become someone who deserved the trust I had so carelessly discarded.